Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Harold Callahan spent his life shaping wood, trimming imperfections, finding beauty where others saw only chips and dirt. He took pride in what he did. His furniture carried more than utility, they had soul. They were silent witnesses of decades of honest work, sleepless nights, calloused hands. But now, at 70, after heart surgery, he found himself confined to a wheelchair, half his body unresponsive and his head filled with memories that no longer had a place to rest. His voice had lost its firmness, his fingers could barely hold a glass of water, and each morning seemed like a battle won simply by continuing to exist. The routine, once involving tools, straight lines, and the smell of freshly cut wood, was now reduced to long silences, pills lined up on a tray, and brief visits that ended with empty promises of "see you soon." Claire, his oldest daughter, entered the room with the hesitant step of someone carrying something too heavy to hold for long. Harold immediately realized something was wrong. She approached slowly, holding her own hands, breathing with effort. She sat down in front of him and stayed quiet for a few seconds. When she finally managed to speak, her voice trembled but was steady enough to cut through the heavy air in the room. "Dad. Mom cheated on you." Harold remained still, as if the words lacked the strength to fully reach him. Claire then explained. She said she discovered everything by accident while going through old boxes in the attic, sorting documents to handle hospital matters. She found letters. Many. Some folded inside still sealed envelopes, others opened, yellowed with time. All written by Dan Holloway, Harold's best friend. And all addressed to his mother, Margaret. The letters spoke of meetings, of missed moments, of shared experiences while Harold was away taking a technical course. Claire, disbelieving, read them one by one. And it was there, among those fragile pages covered in unfamiliar memories, that the truth revealed itself like a sharp knife. Dan. The name echoed inside Harold like a low blow. The one who had been with him since their youth. The same man who helped build his first workshop in the backyard. The man who held his children in his arms when they were born, who attended every birthday, who sat at his table as part of the family. Harold treated him like a brother. Trusted him as though they shared blood. Dan was a constant presence in everything that mattered. It would never have crossed Harold's mind that behind so many smiles and toasts, there was a dark secret hidden for decades. The cruelest part was realizing that, while he studied to become a better carpenter, while he dedicated himself to building a future for his family, Margaret and Dan were quietly tearing it all apart. Claire hesitated before continuing. There was more. She confessed that, after finishing the letters, she spent days in silence trying to figure out what to do. Until she decided to confront her mother. Margaret didn't deny it. She admitted the affair, saying it was fleeting, an old mistake, an emotional confusion. She tried to downplay it, but Claire wouldn't accept it. During the conversation, her mother accidentally let slip that back then, during the affair, she thought she was pregnant, and the dates matched Jonathan's conception. The sentence came out amidst weak justifications, but it stuck in Claire's head like a bomb about to explode. That's why she decided to tell her father everything. Because the pain of carrying this secret alone was worse than any consequence that might follow. Harold didn't react. Or at least, not in the way Claire expected. No tears, no shouting. But inside, something collapsed irreversibly. His trust, his love, his entire story. Everything suddenly seemed like a structure he built with his own hands, now crumbling brick by brick in front of him. The ground he always believed was solid had been mined. Margaret, the woman he shared his whole life with, the one he embraced on good days and bad, had lied. Dan, his brother in spirit, had betrayed him. And the son he raised with pride, dedication, and love, now came wrapped in doubt. Jonathan. The boy from afternoons in the workshop, the one who doodled designs on napkins, who got scraps of wood just to feel useful beside his dad. The same one who knocked everything over but smiled as if he'd built a castle. He was part of everything Harold valued. Thinking that maybe he was the result of another story, another truth, felt crueler than any physical pain. Harold wanted to stand up from his chair, but his body no longer obeyed. He wanted to ask why, but the words got stuck. This wasn't just betrayal. It was the total collapse of a life. The breaking of what seemed eternal. And worst of all, the coldness with which Margaret handled it, as if it were just a silly mistake from the past. Faced with that, Harold chose silence. A silence not empty, but filled with everything he couldn't say. Claire respected it. She stayed by his side, silently. Just watched him take a deep breath, fix his eyes somewhere distant, and lose himself in his thoughts. That moment marked the end of the version of the family history he believed he knew. Nothing seemed real anymore. Everything he built, from the first piece of furniture to the last Christmas photo, was now shrouded in uncertainty. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. His head spun like a loose saw blade, slicing through every memory with the edge of doubt. He didn't know what would come next. But he knew nothing would ever be the same again. Jonathan took a few days to show up after Claire told him everything. Harold didn't ask about him, but he thought about him. Thought about it like someone who feels a different kind of absence, as if waiting for an answer that wouldn't come from anyone's mouth, only from the right gesture. He didn't want explanations, didn't want his son to take sides, and didn't even know how he'd react if he saw him. He feared looking at him and seeing Dan's face. He feared not feeling the same. But he missed him. A missing feeling louder than any scream. The thoughts dragged him back to the days when Jonathan was little, when he'd run home from school and drop his backpack just to go straight to the workshop, where Harold let him hammer useless pieces of wood pretending it was part of some important project. It was in these moments that he saw himself reflected in his son. And now, knowing everything he did, doubt invaded even those memories. It was late one afternoon, when Claire left to buy medication, that Jonathan showed up. He knocked on the door and walked in slowly, as if asking permission from the environment before facing his father. Harold lifted his eyes. For a second, they just stared at each other. Not a word was spoken. And yet, what was in that look said more than any rehearsed sentence. Jonathan looked uncertain, like someone unsure whether he'd be welcomed or rejected. But he came in. Sat on the chair next to Harold's armchair. Placed his hands on his knees and took a deep breath. He said he heard from Claire. Said he felt the ground disappear beneath him. That he never imagined carrying such doubt about himself. He told him he spent his whole life certain he was Harold's son, that everything he learned, everything he became, came from his father's hands. Carpentry, patience, respect for small things. According to him, all of that was passed from father to son. And even if there was now a question about blood, what mattered was who raised him. Harold listened. Didn't interrupt. Didn't even blink. Hands motionless on his lap. Jonathan then said he knew his father was hurt. That he had no idea the pain of having trust broken like that. But he also admitted the fear of losing his father, not because of the truth, but because of bitterness. Because, to him, losing the bond with Harold would be like erasing his own history. Harold tried to respond, but his voice failed. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He felt his throat tighten, his eyes burn. He wanted to say he understood, that he was scared too. That he woke up every day trying not to think, but failed. That he felt his presence even when he was away. But all he managed was a short, almost imperceptible gesture toward the shelf. Jonathan didn't understand. He looked to the side, then at his father, and just stayed still. Harold insisted on the gesture. Pointed again. His fingers trembled, but there was urgency. Claire arrived shortly after and noticed the scene. She asked what was happening, and Harold, with effort, whispered a single word, tools. Claire stood up and went to the garage cabinet, where Harold kept an old box full of instruments he used since he was young. Hammers, chisels, worn rulers. That was his life packed into wood and metal. Jonathan approached and recognized the box. He remembered the times he pretended to be an apprentice, imitating his father sanding pieces, and proudly smiling at the end of the day when he received praise. He picked up the box and brought it to him carefully. Placed it on the table. When Harold saw it, his eyes welled up. That was more than wood and steel. That was who he was. It was the invisible link between him and the boy now standing in front of him, now grown, with doubt in his eyes, but with the same heart as before. And right there, without speeches, everything was explained. A tear fell heavily, without resistance. Jonathan didn't say anything. He simply extended his hand, and Harold held it. Weak, trembling, but secure. It was the gesture he needed. It was what was missing to say that, regardless of what the test later showed, what existed between them was stronger than any detour from the past. That moment rewrote everything. Didn't erase the pain. But made space for something new. There were no more questions between them. Only the certainty that, despite the wounds opened, there was still enough love to mend what had been torn. Harold looked at his son and, without speaking, knew that he was the same boy who used to carry wood in his small arms. The same one who laughed with crooked teeth and tried to mimic his serious expression. The same one who, without knowing, had just saved his father from the hole he had been sinking into since the discovery. That toolbox was more than a symbol. It was the connection. And that afternoon, Harold understood that, despite everything, there was still a part of him that endured. And that part had a name. Strong hands. Eyes like his. History. And it was alive right in front of him. For days, Harold observed the toolbox on the table as if staring into a mirror. Each object there carried weight, history, and a kind of truth that couldn't be questioned. It was as if he were trying to recover something he had left behind. A time when everything seemed simpler, clearer. But no matter how much Jonathan had brought that meaningful gesture, there was something still eating away at him inside. It was the kind of discomfort that doesn't allow peace. No matter how much his son showed love, no matter how present he was, Harold felt an invisible crack running through every memory. The doubt Margaret had planted, even unintentionally, needed a definite answer. He needed to know. Not to push Jonathan away. But to be able to love him without fear, to look into his eyes and be certain that no shadow separated them. Claire understood this before he even said a word. She knew her father well enough to realize that this anxiety ran deeper than any physical pain. One quiet afternoon, while adjusting the medicine on the small table, she approached and asked if he wanted to do a DNA test. Harold only shook his head firmly. It was a clear, precise response. He had made his decision. And it wasn't motivated by resentment or suspicion against his own son. It was the need to know where he stood, to rebuild the foundation that had collapsed without warning. Claire was the one who arranged everything. She contacted a specialized clinic, scheduled the procedure, and handled every detail with the delicacy of someone holding a cracked crystal. Jonathan was informed. He listened in silence, looked at Claire, and said he agreed. Said he understood. That he wasn't offended. He only wanted his father to find the peace he deserved. The two went together to the location. Claire accompanied them. The process was quick. A simple collection, a weight that felt far too long for someone carrying years of stories in his chest. When they left, Harold remained silent the entire way. Not because he had nothing to say, but because everything he thought was too heavy to turn into words. The wait for the results was one of the hardest phases of his life. Harder than the days in the hospital. Harder than hearing about the betrayal. Because there was no action, no possible reaction. Just time. And each minute seemed to mock his anxiety. Every sound of the doorbell made his heart race. Every step Claire took toward the door was followed by a tense stare. With each envelope delivered, his breath caught for whole seconds. Until one day, without ceremony, it arrived. A white envelope, sealed, with his name written in the upper corner. Claire picked it up. Looked at him. And knew it wasn't just any document. It was the line separating two completely distinct realities. Harold asked them to wait for Jonathan. He wanted them all together when they read it. Claire agreed. Called her brother. A few hours later, he arrived. Same calm expression, attentive eyes. There was courage there. The courage to face the truth without armor. The three of them sat down. Claire handed the envelope to her father. His hands trembled. The paper resisted between his fragile fingers. Jonathan offered help, but Harold gestured with his eyes asking them to wait. He needed to be the first to see. Needed to feel, in his own hands, the truth that would change everything. When he finally opened it, he pulled out the folded sheet, reading slowly, line by line. Claire and Jonathan waited. The silence in that moment was thick. The sound of the clock ticking seemed deafening. Harold read it again. Closed his eyes. Took a breath. And cried. Cried like someone carrying too much weight for too long. Cried like someone who had finally found rest. Jonathan was his son. No doubts. Biologically, officially, in numbers and words, he was his. Claire held her father's hand. Jonathan simply lowered his head, as if an ancient tension had finally been ripped from his chest. Harold took a few minutes to regain composure. Wiped his face with the tissue Claire handed him and looked at his son. That look already said everything. Different. Complete. Free. The confirmation didn't erase the past. The pain of the betrayal still remained. Margaret still lingered as a painful memory. But now, at least, he knew that in the middle of everything, there was an undeniable truth: Jonathan was part of him. In fact. By right. In essence. And that changed everything. That gave meaning to the effort, the memories, the presence. It freed him from a silent fear that had been consuming him day after day. Harold took the test paper, folded it carefully, and asked for it to be stored with the toolbox. To him, that was like adding another piece to his identity. From that moment on, the air seemed lighter. Jonathan's gestures gained a new glow. Claire's words sounded easier to hear. The house, which until then seemed submerged in a nameless mourning, now breathed. Slowly, Harold began to rise, not physically, but from within. Began allowing himself to exist again. Because now, doubt had turned into certainty. And it was on this certainty that he would begin rebuilding. After receiving the test results, Harold spent hours in silence, staring into nothingness, the paper still open on his lap. The confirmation was clear, objective, leaving no room for doubt: Jonathan was his biological son. But beyond the signed lab report, that truth calmed something that had burned inside him for far too long. He knew. He always knew. Since the first wooden toy they made together, since the afternoons when Jonathan knocked everything over trying to learn how to build. He was his son. In every gesture, every facial feature. But now he had proof, even for the pain. The doubt was buried. And that freed a part of him that had been suffocating. Jonathan cried. So did Claire. No words were spoken for a few minutes. It was as if the air were heavy with contained emotion. But Harold didn't cry at that moment. The emotion that overwhelmed him was different. It was a mix of relief, gratitude, and above all, clarity. And with that clarity came a decision he had been postponing. Margaret still lived in that house. Still used the same rooms, walked the same hallways. Sometimes, she made coffee. Sometimes, she asked routine questions, pretending nothing had happened. But everything had happened. And every gesture of hers was like a living reminder of everything he had lost. That night, Harold called Claire and said clearly, he wanted to talk to Margaret. But this time, no intermediaries. He wanted her there, sitting in front of him. Not to argue. Not to hear apologies. Just so he could put an end to something that had dragged on too long. Claire hesitated but understood. She walked to her mother's room, knocked on the door, and warned that her father wanted to talk. Margaret responded only with a muffled "okay." She took a few minutes to appear. When she entered, she wore a mixture of tiredness and suspicion on her face. She had avoided serious conversations since Claire revealed the betrayal. She moved around the house as if walking on thin ice, trying to act normally where normality no longer existed. Harold sat in the armchair, his hands resting on the arms of his wheelchair. Claire stood beside him. Margaret stopped in front of both of them. She waited for someone to speak, but the silence felt harder than any word. Until Harold spoke. With a low voice, but firm. He said he knew everything. That the letters Claire found, the betrayal with Dan, the doubt about paternity, everything had been uncovered. Margaret lowered her eyes. Tried to justify herself, but Harold weakly raised his hand and asked her to listen. He said he spent months trying to find a reason for it all, questioning himself every day, losing sleep, getting sick, both in body and soul, trying to hold on to a marriage that had already ended without him knowing. Margaret started crying. Said she regretted it, that it was a mistake, that she thought Harold would never find out. Said she loved her children, that she thought she was protecting everyone by keeping the secret. But Harold no longer wanted explanations. He said the love between them was real, yes, but that it died the moment she allowed Dan to cross the line. That the years that followed, even filled with routine and family affection, were lived on a foundation of lies. And now that the truth had surfaced, he couldn't live under the same roof with her anymore. He said he deserved to spend the time he had left in peace. Margaret sat down. She hadn't expected that level of clarity. She thought he would never have the strength to ask her to leave. But he did. Because it wasn't just about the betrayal anymore. It was about respect. And it was precisely out of respect for her as the mother of his children that he said all that calmly, without yelling, without resentment. Harold asked her to pack her things and move in with someone trustworthy. Claire, watching everything with tears restrained on her face, said she had already considered that. An old family friend, Miriam, had offered a room in her house, if Margaret needed it. It was a small house, but welcoming, in a nearby neighborhood. Margaret agreed. She stood up, looked at Harold, and simply said, "I'm sorry." He responded with a slight nod. It was the most forgiveness he could offer at that moment. The next morning, Claire helped her mother pack. Jonathan spent the afternoon with his father. Margaret left without making a scene. She simply walked through the door, carrying luggage heavier inside than out. When the house returned to silence, Harold closed his eyes and allowed himself something he hadn't felt in a long time: rest. Real, complete, uninterrupted. For the first time since the surgery, since the test, since the discovery, he could breathe without a weight on his chest. The following days were different. The house, now lighter, seemed to breathe with him. Claire took care of meals, medications, conversations. Jonathan started visiting the workshop frequently. He brought projects, ideas, pieces of wood. Harold, even with limitations, got involved. Gave instructions, corrected measurements. Laughed occasionally. Over time, he began to feel alive again. One day, Claire asked what he wanted to do to celebrate his 70th birthday. He said he didn't want a party. Just wanted his kids around. And that's exactly what happened. On a simple afternoon, Jonathan arrived with a gift in his hands. A carefully wrapped box. He said it wasn't anything big. Harold opened it patiently. Inside was a miniature crib, made with precise joints. It was a replica of what Harold had built decades ago. His eyes filled with tears. But there was something more. Jonathan asked him to look at the bottom of the box. There was a folded sheet, carefully placed. It was a DNA test. A second one. Done by Claire when she was still a teenager, after overhearing Margaret mention, during a phone call with a friend, the doubt about paternity. Claire had never told anyone. She kept the result for years. She was afraid of destroying the family. And now, she handed it to her father as a way of sealing everything. The result, the same, Jonathan was Harold's biological son. No margin for error. Harold closed his eyes, held the sheet, and cried. A clean tear, without pain. After everything, what remained was the essential. Love for his children. Dignity restored. And the certainty that, even after the storm, it was still possible to rebuild, piece by piece, as he always did, with wood and soul. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.